free will is a complicated subject in many ways, but it's also incredibly simple. It's a bit like consciousness in the fact that it's simultaneously the most mysterious, mystifying thing in the world, the greatest mystery that scientists and philosophers have been battling about for centuries and more. But at the same time, the most obvious and straightforward thing in the world because you interact with the world through it. You know what it feels like to freely decide to come to a talk. But the position that you're sat in, maybe your legs crossed over another, you could choose at any moment to swap them over. And it feels like you have some agency over that. It feels like you're the author of that action, that if I rewound that clock, went back in time, you could have done something differently. And you could have done something differently based on your own decision-making, that you could have chosen to do that of your own accord.
To be clear, you could have only made a different decision if you have the knowledge that you actually made that decision originally to say, I'm not going to make that decision this time.
It's a difficult thing to define precisely, but it's something like the ability to have acted differently if you were to rewind that clock. And the reason that's a troublesome concept for many people is that anything that happens is going to happen for some kind of reason. Now, some people might object that some things might happen for no reason. There might be random events in the universe. One thing to note is that if something is random, then by definition, you're not in control of it. But if some event is not random, what that means is that something has determined it to be the case. Something has made it so that this happened rather than that happened. Any event that happens inside of your head, that is the motivation to switch your legs over, or the decision to raise your hand, or to put it down again. These are mental events. It comes from your brain. Your brain tells you to do this, or your brain tells your arm to go up and down.
I would say that you are your brain, but yeah, I see where he's going with that.
And the question you have to ask of any event, including mental events, is it determined or is it random? If it's not random, then it's determined by something. There's something that made you raise your hand.
When Alex says determined by something, he gives away the whole game, because religious people will say that we have souls because they want some pure entity that is clearly just them, and they want to impart the property of free will onto this entity and say that's us. But even that doesn't have some ultimate free will undetermined by anything, because your feelings, your desires, your instincts, all of these had to come from somewhere. What about the very inner workings of your mind, the very methodology that your brain uses to actually think, the foundation of thought? We don't decide any of that, but all of this comes together to form what we think of as ourselves. So instead, we should define free will as a conscious entity that is capable of making its own conscious decisions. This way we anchor free will to a system that gives rise to consciousness that then exudes influence over that system, rather than where the system came from and whether it's predictable or not. We could also define like some constraints for these systems, like having a functional memory.
Or maybe it's something else inside of your head. Maybe you raised your hand because you wanted to ask a question. So something inside you wanted to ask a question. But then you just push the problem back. You ask of that mental event, you wanting to ask a question, that desire to ask a question. That itself is either determined or it's random. And again, if it's random, you're not in control of it. The desire just popped into your head and you have no control whatsoever over it. Okay, well if it was determined by something, then once again, that thing will either be determined by something inside of your head, or eventually you'll go down this chain far enough and it will go somewhere outside of your head. Maybe you want.
Now, I used to also think that if there's like actual random events happening in your head, then that must mean you don't actually have free will. But this is only true if those random events are somehow corrupting your consciousness. So if you have like a random desire for chocolate in one universe and a random craving for vanilla in another, and that leads you to different decisions, both versions still had free will, but the stimuli that they were reacting to was different. Now, this randomness was more intrusive, such that it actually affected thinking or consciousness, then we might have a problem. Those are foundational aspects of what we consider to be you, and therefore your free will in that case would be questionable.
You wanted to ask a question because your friend whispered in your ear and said, can you ask this for me, And that's what caused you to do it. And if it comes from outside of you, then you're definitely not in control. So if any mental event, it's either going to terminate in randomness, which you're not in control of, or it's going to have some determinate cause, which will either itself terminate somewhere randomly in your mind, or eventually the causation will go so far back that it will go outside of yourself, outside of your brain. I hope that.
So he's trying to pinpoint exactly where would free will even exist. Is it here? No. Let's go deeper. Is it in here? No. Well, if I can never pinpoint and say, this is where free will is, right there in your brain, therefore, you must not have free will. But that's not true, because I would say free will, just like consciousness, is an emergent property. For example, if I say something is a car, one could say, well, are the tires a car? No. Is it the body? No. Is it the engine, transmission? No, I can't point at any part of this car and just call that part of a car. And that's because the thing that we call a car is an emergent property. It only exists when you have all of the components working together. And Alex gives a pretty good intuitive definition of free will here. But the issue is that he attached baggage when trying to show that we don't have free will. The truth is, yes, the outcome of your free will could very well be predictable. That doesn't mean you don't have free will. It just means that it's predictable. If I offer you $1,000 or $1, I can pretty accurately predict that you'll take the $1,000. You still have free will, it's just it's very predictable what your free will lead you to do. Because as a wise man said, you don't will what you will. So there's a lot of variables that are already set in stone, but then based off of those variables, we make decisions. So it's not that we don't have free will or consciousness, it's that that free will and consciousness is going to be tied down to the variables that were already decided for us by biology. So we don't eat random things, like we don't eat dirt and debris, but why not? You have the free will to go and do so, but you're not going to do it because your every instinct tells you not to do that, and it's gross, and you don't want to do that, right? That makes you predictable. These things are constraints that make you predictable, but that doesn't mean you didn't have the free will. You just didn't want to do it, right?
That makes some sense. It's a complicated subject, but hopefully we can dig into it a bit more. And I'm sorry that also wasn't particularly brief, but such is my way with things.
That's okay. I'll cut you off halfway through the next slide. You describe yourself, Alex Carter, as a compatibilist. Would you mind just briefly describing what that means and where you stand on free will?
Sure. So I agree with everything Alex just said. It's not a very good debate so far, is it? But I also make the claim that there is a semantic difference between being compelled to act and being freely acting, so acting of your own volition. And what we mean by that is not that it's uncaused, but rather that the cause can be roughly designated as myself. Now, what that means is you can look for scientific causes of my actions, and that's absolutely fair enough. But a scientific explanation of an event is one type of explanation. So to borrow Alex's analogy, but to actually connect it with an example that Wittgenstein himself uses, if we see a tree and the leaves are blowing in the wind, in the past we might have said, oh, the leaves are dancing. And now we might say, if only I know the velocity of the wind and the elasticity of the leaves, I can predict exactly how that tree is going to move. But the point is, the second one being true doesn't mean we can't also say the first one. It doesn't mean that we can't also go back to saying the leaves are dancing. The problem is we probably won't say both.
I think he's kind of besides the point, because when people say free will, sometimes they really mean that something is really willing what it wills, right? Which is impossible. So when people say that you have free will, yeah, generally they do mean that you just had the agency, you had the consciousness and the state of mind to be able to make your own decisions unabated. And you could look for like scientific reasons, like such as, well, statistically speaking, if I put you in this situation, you're probably going to do that. It's like, yeah, because the outcome of free will is generally going to be predictable if you look at determinism. And if it's not predictable, then I would actually argue that you don't have free will. Free will only exists if it's predictable. Only if determinism can allow us to predict every single thing that you're going to do, only then do you actually have free will. Because if it was unpredictable, then what caused it? What are you doing? Are you saying that there's like some magical being outside of this universe that cannot be predicted, and that's what's controlling you? Because that's not true, right? But that's what religious people think, and they're obviously wrong because I say so. But since that's not the case, the only way that your free will can't be predictable is if there's randomness in your free will, and that means you don't have free will because it's random.
So the point is they're compatible because they are meaningful areas of discourse. Now, what gets thrown in my face is often this comment, that's just semantics. Do you know what semantics is? It's what meaning is. So the problem with appealing to or rejecting it as just semantics is that you're rejecting the very words that we're using to utter these sentences that we're both using right now. So,
well, when they say that it's just semantics, they're probably saying, well, that's not the version of free will that I want to be true, right?
There's a lovely line.
People generally want the free will that religious people say that we have. Because that's what we feel intuitively. That's how we feel, like we are just free spirits inside of like a body, and we can do whatever we want. That's generally true. It's just that what you want was not determined by you.
Line by one philosopher who says, yes, that's what free will means, but it's not what free will is. And I said, but the problem is you've just used the term free will twice. You use the same term each time, and that's your problem. You need to be able to explain that. So I totally agree that we can use science to explain events, but I also think there are some things which science can't explain just because it's the
I really like that. That's what free will means, but that's not what free will is. That's somebody using the same word twice, but not meaning it in the same way twice. So that's not what free will is. Means that he thinks that probably that you should be able to will what you will to some extent, which again, even religious people can't really explain that, because where did the will that we have come from? Did we will what we will already, and this is like the outcome of us willing what we will? Because obviously that's not true.
If I were to sort of trip over coming off the stage, and I
Please don't.
pushed Alex off the stage, I sort of fell into him, fell off the stage, then that would be pretty bad, right? But if I just got up and pushed him off the stage, that feels different. And the thing that feels different is that when I pushed him off the stage, I freely did it of my own accord. And when I fell and tripped, I didn't freely do that. That wasn't my fault. Thing is, on a practical level, this is where it makes sense to say, well, as long as the action originates with me, we'll call it free, because this is really practical. It means that I can hold somebody culpable for pushing someone, where I don't hold somebody culpable for tripping up. That's fine. So on a practical level, when it comes to our laws, when it comes to the way that we interact with each other, we can use this free will.
I do want to define what it means to like come from me, because it should mean that you have some like functional system in which your consciousness does arise unabated and is able to express itself by making decisions freely.
And I think people do, they use the term free will to describe something like that, something like your actions coming from within you. But if we're interested in philosophy, if we're interested in what's actually happening, what's really going on here, I would say that I had as much control over either of those actions. Because whatever compulsion came over me to get up and push him off the stage, I didn't control it. I didn't bring it about. You know? I mean, imagine it were the case that I did that. I stood up and I pushed you off the stage. And then it was discovered that I had some kind of brain tumor that was pressing up against the part of my brain that deals with rational decision making and deals with ethical thinking. That I had some tumor growing on it. And that I only started getting up and pushing people randomly once that tumor had developed. Would you think I was less responsible for that? Would you be less angry with me, I mean to say? Would you feel like I'm not as bad of a person if you discovered that the reason why I was...
Yeah, so I would probably think that you were less bad of a person. I would probably blame you a lot less, right? And the reason is that, again, you don't will what you will. So you do have the free will, and you probably knew it was a bad thing, but the compulsion could have been so strong that you did it anyway. Or not just the compulsion, but your free will was actually being held back by that tumor or whatever pushing at your logic centers. I would argue that your free will was actually taken away, because at some point we do have to dissect the problem and say, okay, there needs to be like a certain level of freedom or flexibility in order to say that something actually has free will. Because if I program a computer to do something and then it does it, even if that computer has consciousness, it doesn't have free will, because that consciousness is not able to override the program that I put. It's going to do exactly what I told it to do, no matter whether it has consciousness or not. And therefore, that's kind of the same situation where you have something pushing against the logic centers of your brain. So now you're not thinking logically. It's difficult for you to think logically. Your free will has basically been undermined. So I wouldn't say that I blame you less, because you had just as much free will in both of those situations. And this actually proves determinism, such that free will doesn't exist. It actually shows that the system in which free will arises is very important. You have to be able to analyze the system itself to say, what is the quality of consciousness? What is the quality of free will that this system can actually produce? I think that's very important.
Pushing people off stages is because I had a brain tumor. Would you say it's my fault that I was pushing them off the stage? Maybe not. And why not? Well, because sure, like I was pushing them off the stage, but it was because of something happening in my brain that I had no control over that made me do it. Well, such is every action we ever commit.
But you do have some control over it, because you are your brain. So even when your brain tells you to do something, that's you telling yourself to do something. Now, certainly there's parts of your brain that you don't have control over. So when I say the brain is you, I'm talking about specifically the part of your brain that gives rise to consciousness, because those conscious thoughts have direct impacts on what you do, your decisions, right? So the fact that you have a consciousness, and that consciousness directs your brain in general to do things like where you're going to go, what you're going to eat, things like that, that's what I would say is free will, the conscious ability to make your own decisions, even though you didn't will what you will. If I want to eat pizza, I didn't will myself to liking pizza. I like pizza. Therefore, my consciousness and my free will is probably going to make me gravitate towards pizza, right? That's predictable. But that doesn't mean that I didn't have the free will. It just means that my free will operates within known variables and known constraints, right? I'm not going to eat bark no matter how much free will I have, because I don't have the will to eat bark. That desire just isn't there.
Actions. So you can salvage the language of free will, I think. But I think it only really works on a practical level. When we talk about free will on a philosophical level, I think the thing that people want is authorship over their actions. They want control. That's what they're interested in. They don't want, some anyone here heard of Thomas Hobbes? Anybody know who Thomas Hobbes is? Very famous political philosopher.
I think he's absolutely right there. People want authorship and ownership over their actions, but when you say, but determinism, it seems to take it away, because you're saying that everything that you do is basically predetermined even by your genetics, by the laws of physics, by the Big Bang, by all of these things. But again, those things shaped the system that you exist in. You still identify that system as you. That's the important part. Not that the system somehow must originate from some soul or spiritual aspect that defined the system itself and it inhabits that system, like religious people believe. But the fact that you identify that system as being part of you, and then that being part of you has given rise to consciousness that can then exude influence over the decisions of the system. That is the entire point of what free will is. And when someone says, well, I want to be able to have actual ownership or authorship of these actions, I don't want them to be predetermined or such. What they're really saying is, I wish that I could will what I will, because that's the only missing piece of the puzzle, right? If you could will what you will, you would have 100% control over literally everything ever in your brain in terms of free will, consciousness, and all of that. You could will yourself to like this or like that, and then truly, there would be nothing constraining you. And then you would have the physics-breaking free will that people apparently want so badly, which apparently God even has, even though that doesn't seem to be the case, because if God has desires, which it seems that he does, where did those come from? Did he give himself those desires? And so it just doesn't make sense. And so you would also have to not only be able to will what you will, but you would have to even be able to design and create the very logic system that your brain exists on. So even thought, it would be like programming a computer from a blank slate into an entire brain. It's just like, yeah, I guess it's possible that I could create a being like that, and then that being could be like an extension of my free will, perhaps, maybe. But the idea that you have to be able to do all of these things with no foundational base to start from, right? You can't have a brain that creates another brain, because where did that brain come from? So therefore, free will is completely impossible. Free will is just the fact that you can make your own decisions, just the fact that your decisions are constrained by the very logical system that your consciousness is born from, which your brain operates with, the fact that your brain has desires and instincts built into it from evolution. Those are constraints on what your free will like to do and will not like to do. And yes, that does make you predictable, but again, it doesn't mean that you didn't have the free will. It just means that your free will is generally predictable.
And he's one of the most famous early compatibilists. And he thought that freedom is something like being unobstructed by external constraints. And he said it's a bit like a river being free to run, not impeded by some big rock in its way.
That's okay, right? Not being impeded by external constraints. But there are internal constraints, right? Just like the river is obviously free to run if there's no external constraints, but there are internal constraints. Why is the river going this way? Why not the other way? Why is it going right? Why is it going left, right? So there's internal constraints on this river.
The river is free to run down its course. There's a sense in which, on a practical and poetic level, you can say, yes, the river is free to run where it wouldn't be if I put a rock in its way. But on a philosophical level, if I said that river had free will, I don't think I would be talking much sense.
Well, if you just gave it a consciousness and it's not able to exude any sort of influence with that consciousness, then I would say no, it doesn't have free will. It's stuck, constantly just observing its own actions while having no control over those actions. No one feels that way, right? Nobody feels like, oh yeah, I have consciousness, but I have absolutely zero control over my actions. I am just watching my body and my brain do things that I have no control over. No, we know that we can exude control over our actions through our consciousness. That is what free will is. And that is why when people say, oh yeah, give consciousness to the moon and it's still going to orbit the earth, but now it's going to think that it was its decision to do so. It's like, well, no, because it has absolutely no control over that. If the moon could stop orbiting Earth and then it decided to keep orbiting Earth anyway, then sure, we would say that it kept orbiting Earth because it wanted to do so. But if it couldn't choose otherwise, then it might actually be like, no, I want to stop orbiting Earth, but it's forced to keep orbiting Earth. Just because something has consciousness does not mean it has free will. The consciousness has to be able to exude influence, and that might be very difficult to measure for somebody else, but this might be like one of those I think therefore I am moments until science is able to measure that one day, perhaps.
The response I would give to that is that I think partly it's a quite reductionist view of what language is, that what we're doing is we're reducing all of meaningful language to what is an accurate description of the world. The problem with that is I think philosophy, being both older than philosophy, but being older than science, and older certainly than neuroscience, philosophy is a very old subject, so I would argue the reverse. I would argue that if we're doing it philosophically, we should be talking about, for instance, what were the ancient Greeks talking about when they were talking about free will? They weren't talking about this concept. What was Thomas Hobbes interested in? Probably the same things that many of us are still interested in today, but it is still an older question. He wasn't interested so much in the neurology question simply because that's one way in which we can lose our freedom. Interestingly, Thomas Hobbes supported another another way of losing our freedom, namely claiming that we should have an all-powerful monarch controlling everything we do. He had no problem with that, apparently, which is interesting. But so there are many ways in which I can lose my freedom or not have freedom. So for instance, a kleptomaniac who compulsively steals is not responsible, and we make that claim. So is a child not responsible for certain things, but responsible for other things. We might not hold someone responsible because they were under the influence of some particular drug at the particular time.
And again, these are things that are changing what you will, right? And therefore, you might have like a conscious mind that is able to exude influence, but you have other influences within yourself that are willing you very strongly towards certain behaviors, and those are actually diminishing your free will because they're so strong and so compelling that they might override your logic system that tells you how to think, right? So if your pure instincts, your pure emotion is overriding the actual thoughts that you're having, because free will lives in your actual thoughts and your logical thoughts. It doesn't live in pure emotion. Otherwise, you wouldn't even need a consciousness. Your body could just completely run on pure emotion. But when these things are undermining your ability to think clearly, then they've actually undermined your free will. And I think we know this intuitively because sometimes we are captured emotionally by things, and maybe we're stunned, we're in awe or something like that. And therefore, our free will kind of has diminished because we're so in that moment, we're so captured by the emotion of that moment that our consciousness is having a very vivid experience and is not really thinking.
We might not hold people responsible because we think, well, just in that situation, how could someone help themselves? How could someone actually stop that from happening? So my point is, there are lots of reasons why people have freedom taken away. And actually, one of the biggest problems for compatibilists is that they often have trouble showing why we aren't free. So they often defend free will too well. They'll often say, oh, this is what free will is. But then ultimately you say, but we still deny free will in certain cases. So we need to explain both why some people are free and some people are not free. But there are so many reasons why we say some people are not free that it can't be one reason. It can't be determinism. It can't be scientific explanations. I can lose my freedom because I read a book. And I had this experience. I read Schopenhauer, and he said, we all want to be tragic heroes, but the truth is we're clowns. You want to be a tragic hero because you want to think you're facing real struggles, really important things. But to be honest, if you actually look at the detail of your life, it's kind of silly. And realizing that, I suddenly almost felt like he was seeing me without my clothes on. It was quite embarrassing. It was kind of, oh, okay, that's far too much to admit for myself. But I almost lost a sense of freedom there. So the point is, I can predict my actions based on what a fictional character does. That's not determinism, that's not scientific, but I would still lose my freedom by saying, I'm only doing this because I want to emulate that character. So my point is, there are lots and lots of ways in which we lose our freedom. And that means that it can't just be this reductivist scientific account of why we don't have free will.
I'm not in too much of agreement with the guy on the right, but I'm also not very much in agreement with Alex O'Connor here, because I think the definitions of words are very important, and we don't seem to define free will similarly, even though my definition is way more intuitive to how we actually feel free will, while his definition is more intuitive of how religious people want to think of free will as being granted from God.